Well, The Birth of a Nation, I think that, it's one of those films that oftentimes when people talk about that movie, they talk about it for its technical innovations. For example, the editing. They talk about it in terms of the storytelling, and we herald D.W. Griffith as this wonderful director for bringing that to fruition, bringing that film about. And the way I teach it is I'm really willing to acknowledge all of those things and talk about, yes, it's edited in a way that we hadn't seen. We continue to use those strategies today. The narrative is interesting, for the time in particular. But at the same time, the way that I really discuss that film, and I think it's more important that we remember it as perhaps one of the most racist films ever made in the history, of the film industry. And I say that because obviously, you know, look no further than who rides to victory at the end of the film, and that's the Ku Klux Klan, which persists today and is a domestic terrorist organization that continues to plague people of color and other groups as well. And so I think that we have to be very honest when we teach The Birth of a Nation and talk about what the ramifications of that film have been, including the fact that the Ku Klux Klan used it as a recruiting tool and to my knowledge, continues to use it as a recruiting tool. The fact that after that film, lynchings in the U.S. South went up, particularly because of the way that the character Gus, the savage black man played by Walter Long in blackface, because of the way that he presents the black male as brutal and dangerous, and that he's going to rape white women. Uh, you know, as a result, that fear, playing up on that fear and paranoia associated with black masculinity, it does a lot of damage to black folks in this country. And it's not just on the silver screen, but it's also in society at large. And the thing that D.W. Griffith tells us is that there are two kinds of black folks. There are good black folks and bad black folks. The bad black folks are the ones who want freedom, um, the ones who are pushing whites off sidewalks, the ones who want to have intermarriage, and they don't seem to know their place in society. The good black folks are the faithful souls, the ones who know their place. The mammy who is very happy to serve, who is also played by a white woman in blackface. The old uncle who is also happy to serve, and these folks love their white family so much that they try to save them so that they can potentially be enslaved again. And so those are the good black folks. They know their place in society and they want to stay there. And so it's a really egregious film for several reasons. Blackface, it actually comes over from the stage tradition, which is called minstrelsy, where you would have shows in which whites would, take a pulverized or crushed cork, like the champagne cork that comes out of a wine bottle, or the kind of cork that comes out of a wine bottle or a bottle of champagne, and they would burn it, and they'd mix it with water and make a thick paste out of it. And then what they would do is they would take that and they would rub it all over their face and use generally, some sort of lipstick, maybe red or another color to, widen their lips to give the impression that they had big lips because, of course, all black people allegedly have these big lips. And it would really become this grotesque representation of blackness. Sometimes they would put on woolly wigs and gloves and wear tattered clothes. And then they would go on stage and they would perform in a very stereotypical and caricatured fashion of black life. And so that minstrelsy tradition, that blackface performance where you had whites going on stage and making fun of blacks, crossed over in the films. And so you see in early films sometimes, like The Birth of a Nation, where you see that blackface is crossed over, and hence you have an actor like Walter Long performing in blackface as the character Gus. I believe the actress's name who plays the faithful, loyal mammy, I think her name is Jenny Lee. And that marked actually the first time that a white woman had played a role that was scripted for a black woman on film. And so, yeah, blackface really comes over from stage, and that blackface minstrelsy is the first distinctly American theatrical form. So, when you think about all the beautiful art forms that have been created, whether we're talking about opera or ballet, in the United States, they came up with blackface minstrelsy to remind blacks that they were second-class citizens. In early cinema, and particularly The Birth of a Nation, first and foremost, I think it's important to mention that The Birth of a Nation is the first film to feature all five of the most dominant stereotypes that would circumscribe blacks on cinema for an extended period of time. And so I brought this, we take from the book Tom Coon's Mulattoes, Mammies, and Bucks, which is written by Donald Bogle, to discuss these types. And so we had the Tom, which is a loyal servant. And he's probably represented by that uncle character, that old loyal soul in The Birth of a Nation. You have the Mammy, overweight, asexual, loud, boisterous, cantankerous, but happy to serve. She's another one of the types that we see in The Birth of a Nation. And then you have the buck, which that character Gus, who chases the woman to the top of the cliff, who subsequently jumps. He represents the buck, the savage black male Negro, who is hell bent on raping white women. You have in addition to that, the mulatto figure, or the tragic mulatto, and that was essentially a biracial character, a character who was half black, half white. Oftentimes, you kind of, in a narrative, you kind of like those characters, or you can sympathize with them, but we know that their life is ruined because they are half black. So the black blood coursing through through their veins, excuse me, is a curse of sorts. And then finally, what you would have is the coon character type. And the coon is a character who is really unintelligent, can't speak English correctly, and is just there merely for comic relief, excuse me, and they perpetuate the ideology that black people are stupid. And the thing that people used to say when they were justifying slavery is that if black people are stupid, they're too dumb to take care of themselves, so we need to keep them enslaved and take care of them. So they don't need to be free, they couldn't handle it. And so those are the types, and they're in The Birth of a Nation, but then at the same time, they're in other films beyond that. Films like Imitation of Life, the Shirley Temple film, The Littlest Rebel. We see, those characters in Pinky, which is a film made, during World War II. And so they sustain for a long time. And then, as we progress and cinema progresses, we start to get out of those overtly racist representations of black characters. But at the same time, you can still find those traces in other films, even on up to today. Well, the Jim Crow laws are really interesting because this was this set of regulations that, really helped to segregate the South. And so, for example, if you ever look at any old footage or old documentaries about civil rights and you see, these signs where you have a toilet that's for whites and then a toilet that's for blacks, I mean, that segregation, which is mandated, which is law, really comes out of Jim Crow laws. Another thing that comes out of that, which was ordained by the courts, are laws that said that black folks and white folks couldn't get married or have relationships. And the real concern there was that black people and white people were going to have sex, particularly black men with white women. And a pervasive ideology is that we must protect our white women and their womanhood, and we can't let them be tainted by blacks, and hence lynchings. And so what we start to see are, these laws, even laws that said that, you might live in a town that's highly segregated, and so, for example, that town would have a public library, and so blacks would get paid, and they would make wages in that town. They would, they would pay taxes, which would help pay for the library, right? But they weren't allowed to go into the library, and so those things are all about Jim Crow laws setting up this idea and helping sustain the idea that blacks and whites should be separate, but at the same time they were equal, when that certainly was not the case. For example, if you consider how those laws functioned in terms of, even something as simple as representation in cinema, we can see clearly that there's a distinction between who is supposed to, who is inferior and who is superior. I mean, you can see it there on film. And then if you can take that and you connect the dots out into society and you say that one group has a very nice school with brand new textbooks and the finest teachers and great new gymnasium, whereas another group gets used textbooks, editions that are 5, 10 years old. The gym roof leaks. The teachers who are there because they care, but they don't have access to the best learning materials to teach kids. It's the same thing because it tells you who is more valuable in society, who's inferior and worthy of education versus who is superior and unworthy of education. And as a structure, if Jim Crow is allowed to dictate like that, the people who have lesser means, poorer education, are going to be behind the curve and they can never catch up because the world has not been designed for them. I think that if there is ever a good thing for me that came out of The Birth of a Nation, it's race films. So people would say, well, it's the editing. I was like, no, it wasn't. Like, that was going to happen anyway. But the good thing, the thing that I can look at that came out of Birth of a Nation is the fact that we got these filmmakers like Georgia Noble Johnston, like Oscar Micheaux, who looked at what, D.W. Griffith had done, basing that film off of those novels, The Klansman and The Leopard Spots. They looked at that narrative that they created and they said, blacks, this is untrue. This is not how black people are. And so out of that comes this whole new era of independent filmmaking, which we rarely hear anything about, where you had blacks seizing the means of productions without really being trained, but making films to demonstrate what black life was. for me, that's huge. I think for blacks at the time, that was huge. And so they had to have a separate cinema because the more mainstream cinema, if you will, was depicting blacks as monolithic, saying that there were these egregious things. And blacks said, no, we're not that. And we're going to show you what we are. So I think it's very courageous, ultimately, at the time that these films start coming out for blacks to do that. And then obviously, they didn't have access all the time to the best theaters or in town, or if they did get access, they had to show their films at midnight in what was called midnight rambles. And so you had the theater owners would say, okay, you can't come during matinee hours. You're not going to be here during the evening show. But at midnight, when the theaters close down, we will let black people come in and you can see films. And that's when they showed those race films at these things called midnight rambles a lot of times. In other instances, they showed them in churches, wherever they could, just again to give the idea, to show an image of black folks that said we're not Tom, Coon, Mulatto, Mammy, and Buck. And so I think there was a necessity for that at that point in time. And so, those filmmakers like Oscar Micheaux really should hold a bigger place. They should occupy more space in film history. But, you may even ask this class, how many of you have ever heard of race films? And you'll probably find that majority of students have never heard of those things, which is really sad given what race films came to mean to black folks. Just that, as discussed in a documentary called Midnight Ramble that talks about the race films, that it's important to note that in Within Our Gates, Oscar Micheaux really does challenge Birth of a Nation with one scene in which he tries to show who it is who actually rapes who. Rather than having this savage black man, you have this, this white man who is going and he's trying to rape this black woman, much like slave owners used to do to their quote-unquote property during the days of chattel slavery. And I think that that's a really important scene. Again, it's a bold scene and it's a daring scene for the time that that film came out. And I don't think that that should be lost on anybody or glossed over. In addition, he also, puts a lynching in his film to give an idea of what that form of spectacle looked like. And it's a phenomenon that we don't talk about a lot in this country, even today. So to think that in the time when lynchings were still happening, you had this black filmmaker have the audacity, the boldness to put that on screen is a major deal. And it's just, little reasons like that is why we need to continue studying Micheaux's legacy. I mean, I think that what we get in blaxploitation, much like we had race films, now again, race films don't sustain, Oscar Micheaux is the only race film director to make it past the Great Depression, right? And to go on into the era of sound films, solidly and be present there. So, the skewed representations of blacks continue on. I mentioned earlier a film like Pinky, which is a strange film where you have this biracial character and she's being played by a white woman, and it's problematic if you see the film. And so, as you moved on, you get Sidney Poitier, who emerges as the world's biggest movie star, and he's a very good actor and talented actor, but there was a segment of the black population that felt like those films didn't really speak to what was going on at the time. We were moving out of civil rights and nonviolence and thinking about more like Malcolm X and By Any Means Necessary, black nationalism. And, there was a segment of the population that wanted to see that reflected on screen. So what happens then is Hollywood, is looking for a way to raise its ticket sales, and as a result, they turn to these films that become known as blaxploitation films. And so we get films like Shaft and Superfly, which start to counter even, or kind of fill out a range of characterizations of black folks. So we can have Sidney Poitier, but we also have Shaft now. We also have Superfly, right? So blacks can be, they can be doctors. They can also be private detectives. At the same time, understand that, they might be criminals. And so those films come in and they kind of start to serve a purpose in that they're filling out a need of representation and giving a full idea of what black life is, with certain problems in those narratives as well, because they're not perfect either. But it's a really fascinating period, and I think that it's an interesting parallel to race films, actually, albeit in the 1970s context.